The towns of ancient Egypt lay in a ribbon along the Nile River. On either side there is a desert. Originally, Egypt was divided into two kingdoms, Upper, or Southern, and Lower, or Northern Egypt. Nubia, to the south of Aswan, became a part of the Egyptian Empire during the Middle Kingdom. Egypt, like many of the ancient civilizations, grew up on the banks of a major river. The Nile River was mainly responsible for the success of ancient Egypt. The Nile, like many other rivers of the ancient world, flooded the land and washed up layers of rich soil. The Nile River provided the upper and lower regions of Egypt with fertile lands for food to grow and served as a major transportation link. The pyramids at Giza are the most outstanding and best-known pyramids in the world. The Great Sphinx is also located here. The pyramids were built as tombs for the afterlife. The largest pyramid, the Great Pyramid, was built for the pharaoh Khufu and is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid's base is 13 acres and contains over 2 million stones, each weighing 2.5 tons. How the Great Pyramid was built remains a mystery today, since the Egyptians built it without the wheel, beasts of burden, or sophisticated tools and equipment.
The ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for many centuries, from around 3000 to 300 BC. During that time, the Egyptians created massive buildings and elegant works of art. They invented systems of writing, measuring, and counting. They developed a strong centralized government served by well-trained scribes and officials. Egyptian designs and technological achievements were admired and sometimes copied in many countries of the ancient world, and their mysterious, complicated religious beliefs still fascinate scholars and writers today. The earliest Egyptians were nomads, wandering in search of food and water. But by around 2900 BC, at the time of the first recorded Egyptian ruling family, they had been settled in villages along the banks of the Nile for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. From these simple beginnings, the Egyptian state grew very strong. Egyptian kings, known as pharaohs, ruled a large empire. They fought and conquered faraway peoples in present-day Syria, Libya, and Iraq. They traded with merchants from other ancient civilizations, such as the Lebanese and Greeks, who lived around the Mediterranean Sea.
Even though the ancient Egyptian people lived so long ago, we can still find out about their lifestyles, customs, and beliefs. Our information comes from different kinds of evidence: buildings, statues, tombs, inscriptions, and many smaller objects that have survived from ancient times.
Thanks to Egypt's warm, dry, desert climate, many monuments have survived remarkably well. These tombs and temples were decorated with carvings, paintings, and statues. Some show everyday activities. Others show religious scenes. They all tell us something about the way people lived, how they fought and farmed, went hunting, said their prayers, or simply enjoyed themselves. They also help us to discover what the Egyptians looked like, what they ate, and what clothes they wore. Most Egyptian buildings and many works of art are decorated with inscriptions, lines of picture writing called hieroglyphs, carved into their hard stone surface. Because stone is so tough and lasts so long, these inscriptions can still be read even after many centuries have passed. We can also learn about the Egyptians from travelers, such as the Greek writer Herodotus, who visited the country around 500 BC. These travel writings are often very useful, but we cannot believe everything they say. The ancient Egyptians were Northeast Africans whose immediate ancestors were attracted to the Nile Valley because of its pleasant climate and plentiful food. We know from statues, paintings, and mummified bodies that the ancient Egyptians had light brown skins and dark hair. Paintings on wealthy people's tomb walls depict them as slender and graceful in the prime of life, but with rolls of fat when they reached middle age. It was fashionable to be plump, as this showed that they had lived prosperous lives.
The ancient Egyptians mixed with many neighboring peoples. Egyptians in the Nile Delta and the oases of the Western Desert encountered tribes from West Libya. They also got to know black Africans from the region of Nubia and traded luxury goods like gold, ebony, and ivory with them. They had contact with people to the northeast in Palestine and Syria. The result of this intermingling is seen in the ancient Egyptian language, which has connections to the languages spoken in ancient Libya, Nubia, and various other parts of the Middle East.
New blood came into Egypt following its conquest by Alexander the Great in 332 BC, when Greek settlers and traders arrived in large numbers. Roman soldiers were stationed in garrisons along the Nile after Augustus defeated Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BC. Under Augustus, Egypt became part of the Roman Empire, and Christianity became the official religion. But the biggest influx of foreigners, bringing different customs and beliefs, came with the conquering Arab armies in the 7th century AD. This turned Egypt into a country in which the majority of the population is Muslim.
Egypt is well over 90% desert. Life can only exist in oases and areas reached by the waters of the Nile. In ancient Egypt, the Nile began to rise in mid-July. It flooded the surrounding land for about 4 months. When the waters receded, the farmers sowed their crops on a fresh layer of Nile mud. The harvest took place during the last 4 months of the year. The ancient Egyptians thought the flood signaled the arrival of the river god, Hapi. In fact, the flood was caused by heavy rain at the source of the White Nile in modern Uganda and of the Blue Nile in modern Ethiopia. As the two Niles joined to form a single river at Khartoum in modern Sudan, the rich mud was carried hundreds of miles into Egypt. This fertile black silt was the basis of Egypt's wealth, and the Egyptians called their country Kemet, or Black Land, after its color.
The hostile deserts were called Deshret, or Red Land. The deserts were the source of the Egyptians' building materials. Statues and huge obelisks for temples were cut from granite. Sandstone was used for massive gateways, halls, and columns of temples, and limestone was used to build the pyramids. From the eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea coast, the Egyptians obtained vast quantities of gold, copper, and semi-precious stones like orange-red cornelian, green feldspar, and turquoise.
The Nile cuts a narrow passage through Egypt. The Nile Valley in the south is called Upper Egypt. In the north, just beyond modern Cairo, the River Nile fans out to form a delta. This marshy, fertile region is known as Lower Egypt. The pharaohs are often called Lord of the Two Lands, referring to their power over these two areas.
Ancient Egyptian history is divided into 3 main periods called the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. During these periods, the mighty power of the pharaohs was at its height, bringing stability to Egypt. But between these eras were troubled times of royal weakness, violent civil war, and foreign invasion.
King Narmer was the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt under one kingdom in around 3100 BC. He established the capital of Egypt at Memphis. He started to pave the way for a period of great peace and prosperity, known as the Old Kingdom. It is sometimes called the Pyramid Age, as Egypt's newfound wealth enabled these huge tomb monuments to be constructed. The famous pyramids at Giza were built in around 2500 BC.
Mentuhotep was the first pharaoh of the Middle Kingdom and reunited Egypt after the fall of the Old Kingdom and the period of unrest that followed. Other pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom sent out trading and military expeditions and conquered Nubia. But this age of order declined with the invasion of the Hyksos, and Egypt once more became unsettled.
In this period, the capital was moved to Thebes. A number of warrior pharaohs made many conquests, building an empire that stretched from Syria to Nubia. The most powerful of these pharaohs was Ramses II, who built the great temple at Abu Simbel. This age of glory came to an end when Egypt was invaded by foreign peoples, Persians, Greeks, and then the Romans, who ruled until the 7th century AD.
The kingdom of ancient Egypt grew up along the banks of the Nile River in North Africa. It was well positioned for contact with both Mediterranean and Middle East early civilizations.
The Nile River provided a long strip of fertile land, ideal for growing crops. Including the delta, it covered about 13,000 square miles. The ancient Egyptians settled on its banks around 3000 BC and formed one of the most sophisticated early civilizations. The rulers of Egypt were enormously wealthy. They used this wealth to build magnificent temples and tombs. An illustrated tour of Egypt shows some examples of the monuments they created. The Great Pyramids at Giza, the Step Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Great Sphinx, Hatshepsut's Temple, Valley of the Kings, Colossi of Memnon, Tutankhamun's Tomb, Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, and the Temple of Abu Simbel. One of the most famous objects to survive from ancient Egypt is the gold burial mask made to cover the face of the mummified pharaoh Tutankhamun, who died around 1323 BC.
Many of the buildings created by the ancient Egyptians are now ruins. But using our imaginations, we can make good guesses at what palaces and temples looked like. They were built with magnificent hypostyle halls, rooms where the roofs were supported by carved and decorated columns. Often, they were painted to look like reeds. Egyptologists, people who study the ancient civilization of Egypt, use many skills to help them understand the past. By learning about Egyptian art, architecture, paintings, carvings, and inscriptions, and by digging up or excavating ruins, they are able to recreate the past in words and pictures.
Today, most of us can expect to live until we are about 70 years old. This was not the case of ancient Egyptians. Then, life expectancy was short. On average, people lived for 20 years. This suggests that many people died very young. Some lived to perhaps 30 or 40, and a few lived longer. We have no precise figures, but it is likely that many, if not most, babies died before they reached their 5th birthday. Only the strongest survived. These figures had an effect on family life. People got married much younger. For example, Tutankhamun married when he was only 10. The Egyptians must also have gotten used to the frequent death of babies and toddlers. For many Egyptians, especially women, family life was important because their house was also their place of work. Indoors, women and their older daughters cooked, cleaned, and cared for young children. They used the courtyards of their homes for grinding corn, drying fish, plucking waterfowl, baking bread, and brewing beer. They might also spin thread and weave rough fabric for their families' clothes. During busy seasons, they would also help their husbands and brothers who were out working in the fields. For many Egyptians, especially women, family life was important because their house was also their place of work. Indoors, women and their older daughters cooked, cleaned, and cared for young children. They used the courtyards of their homes for grinding corn, drying fish, plucking waterfowl, baking bread, and brewing beer. They might also spin thread and weave rough fabric for their families' clothes. During busy seasons, they would also help their husbands and brothers who were out working in the fields.
There were many gods and goddesses dedicated to mothers and children of all ages. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was dangerous. Many mothers and their babies died during childbirth. The most famous was the goddess Isis, who was the mother of Horus. She was seen as the perfect mother and was thought to have magic power to care for all children and heal from sickness. The dwarf god, Bes, who has a lion's head and bow legs, was believed to protect children from evil spirits.
Most children did not go to school, but boys were taught a trade by their fathers, while girls helped their mothers at home. However, children from rich families were educated. The boys went to school, where they were taught reading, writing, mathematics, religion, and languages. This prepared them for future careers as priests, officials, and scribes, or as doctors and lawyers. The girls often had private tutors. Probably they both learned to write hundreds of different hieroglyphs from as young as 5 years old, and learned to read by chanting the chosen passages together in chorus. However, just like modern children, young Egyptians played many ball games as well as leapfrog and tug-of-war. Little girls played with rag dolls and baby dolls and cradles. Toys that have survived include tops, rattles, and tiny carved wooden animals with movable jaws and tails. Many boards and decorative pieces have been discovered for the board game Senet. This was a favorite game of the young king Tutankhamun.
The ancient Egyptians were a nation of farmers whose prosperity depended on the Nile. Its annual flood brought with it a rich, fertile soil, which was excellent for growing various types of crops. The farmer's year was divided into 3 seasons: the time of the Nile flood, called Akhet, the sowing period, called Peret, and then the harvest, called Shemu. During the flood season, the farmers could not work in their fields, so they had to help with government building projects. However, as soon as the floodwaters receded, the farmers began plowing the land with wooden plows drawn by cattle. They sowed barley and wheat, and harvested the crops with flint-toothed sickles. Egyptians also grew many different vegetables like beans, onions, and lettuces, and fruits like figs, grapes, and dates. Flax was grown to be woven into a fine linen cloth. Failing crops and lack of water sometimes caused bad farming years, so corn was stored in granaries to use in times of famine. The Egyptians had 15 different words for bread. For almost everybody, it was the most important item in their diet. It was made from an early form of wheat called emmer wheat, coarsely ground between millstones or in a hand-held quern. Egyptian bread was made without yeast, so it was flat and quickly became stale. It may have looked like the pita bread we buy today.
Staple foods included beans, onions, and dried meat. The fertile soil around the Nile provided a large amount of fresh fruit and vegetables, such as leeks, cucumbers, radishes, dates, nuts, and melons. Wild birds like geese and duck were caught and eaten. Many people also ate fish. To drink, there was river water, beer, or wine for the rich. Beer was probably safer than plain water, since the alcohol it contained acted as a mild disinfectant. It was made from old bread mixed with plenty of water and stored in covered jars in the sunshine until it fermented. It must have looked like a very muddy soup. Most people liked to strain it before drinking. Many pottery beer strainers have been found.
Food was important in religious festivals and seasonal celebrations. Paintings in tombs show pharaohs and wealthy families feasting on roast duck, beef, honey cakes, fruits, and wine. Not everyone could afford this level of luxury. At a feast, diners were waited on by servants and entertained by musicians, acrobats, and dancing girls. Women sometimes sat separately from the men. To complete the festive mood, the women carried sweet-smelling lotus blossoms, or else wore cones of perfumed grease, which slowly melted in their hair.
Brewing beer was a popular pastime in Egypt. Often the process of making beer was done by men standing inside a vat, trampling the bread and water mixture with their feet. After mixing, the liquid was left to stand in the sun until it fermented. Then it was strained and stored in clean jars. Most household tasks were performed by women, but from the evidence from models and carvings, brewing seems to have been a male specialty.
Oil was used for cooking, in cosmetics, and for lighting.
Metal was precious in ancient Egypt. Bowls and pots for cooking were therefore made of clay. To prepare foods, the Egyptians used knives, sometimes made of flint. Jars were used to store oil, wine, beer, and water. They were made from local clay by skilled Egyptian potters. Most Egyptians ate from plates also made of pottery, which were sometimes decorated with trailing clay patterns.
Rats, mice, and insects brought diseases into Egyptian homes. From the evidence of mummies, Egyptians seemed to have suffered from several unpleasant conditions, from diarrhea and worms to sores and blindness, all caught from animals. Egyptian clothing was lightweight and very simple. The climate was hot, and the fields and roads were dirty, so young children often went naked. Even so, the evidence of paintings, statues, and jewelry that have been found in tombs suggests that some Egyptians, at least, were very interested in their own appearance, and in how other people looked too. For everyday wear, men wore a length of cloth wrapped around their waist, rather like a Scottish kilt. Women wore a long skirt or a sleeveless shirt. This could be topped by a loose overdress or a square of cloth tied rather like a shawl. Ordinary people's clothes were usually white, the natural color of linen or wool. Dyes to produce the bright golds and yellows seen in some tomb paintings were too expensive for most people to afford.
The wealthy, powerful groups in Egyptian society had more money to spend on making themselves look stylish. Their clothes were similar in style to those worn by ordinary people, but made of better fabric. Sometimes it was so fine that it became semi-transparent. In some paintings, the loose flowing robes worn by men and women seemed to be delicately pleated. People kept their best clothes for special occasions. One ancient Egyptian poem encouraged partygoers to put myrrh on your head and clothe yourself in fine linen. Women also wore elaborate party makeup. The characteristic black eyeliner, called kohl, and green eyeshadow have been found in tombs, along with mirrors, curlers, tweezers, ointments, and combs. Egyptian paintings reveal many different hairdressing styles. Children and slaves sometimes had their heads shaved to keep them free from dust and lice. Royalty sometimes grew just one lock of hair long and wore it plaited over one ear. This was a sign of their noble birth. Adults often wore wigs.
Pharaohs and their wives enjoyed wearing splendid clothes, jewels, wigs, scent, and makeup. Their finery reminded ordinary people of their majesty and power.
Without the Nile, Egypt would not exist. There would be no water and no fertile land to grow food. Egyptian rainfall is low, about 4 to 6 inches in an average year. The climate is hot. Even in the winter, temperatures seldom fall below 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The surrounding desert lands show the natural results of weather conditions like these. But Egypt has the Nile. It is one of the world's greatest rivers and flows for a vast distance, about 4,160 miles, in a valley bordered by rocky cliffs and hills. Once a year, between July and October, the Nile flooded and covered the valley floor with a thick layer of mud and silt. Over many centuries, this had been built up into a layer of damp, warm, rich soil. It is where the ancient Egyptians lived and grew their crops. If, as occasionally happened, the Nile floods failed, there was famine in the land. Since the Aswan Dam was completed in 1968, the Nile no longer floods.
Egyptian farmers planted grains, lentils, beans, and vegetables in the wet Nile mud. Crops grew quickly and gave good yields. The fresh silt every year acted as a natural fertilizer. The farmers dug irrigation ditches to spread the floodwaters as far as possible and to maintain a steady water supply once the flood season was over. They built ingenious machines, such as the shadoof, to raise water from the river and pour it over the fields. Ferries and cargo boats steered a careful course through the winding river channels. Cows, donkeys, rats, dogs, and small children paddled in the waters at the river's edge. Women gathered to wash dirty clothes, chatting and laughing together. Drinking water was drawn straight from sewage-polluted shallows. The river of life was also a breeding ground for disease.
Egyptian farmers probably made and mended many of their own agricultural tools. These were often very simple and were constructed of wood. The tools did the job well if the man, using them, knew what he was doing and worked hard. There was no time to waste. As well as laboring in the fields, Egyptian villagers gathered clover and other wild plants to feed their cattle and cut rushes to make baskets and mats. They reared ducks and geese. They spun wool to make thread and grew flax in muddy pools. Both were used to weave cloth. Where there was enough land, they planted orchards and vineyards and harvested apples, grapes, and figs. They used the Nile mud to make bricks to build and repair their homes.
Villagers went hunting for wildfowl in the marshes and speared fish from boats or trapped them in nets. Sometimes they went out to kill crocodiles or, less frequently, a hippopotamus. They regarded both as very dangerous creatures. It was also important to try to exterminate the pests that threatened their crops. Mice and locusts were particularly destructive. The Egyptians kept cats. A few, belonging to noble sportsmen, were even trained to retrieve birds that were killed with sticks. Cats killed the mice, but nothing could defend the fields from a swarm of hungry locusts. If they arrived before harvest time, then, as one Egyptian poet wrote, "The rich look worried, and every man is seen to be carrying his weapons." Making sure of a good harvest was a matter of life and death.
The Nile River was home to a great variety of animal life, from tiny water snails to massive crocodiles. Most were harmless, but a few were dangerous to people using the river. Mummies have been found with bones that seem to have been bitten off by crocodile teeth.
At certain times of the year, the Nile flooded. The banks of the river became submerged under the water. However, the Nile provided food as well as water. Fish were trapped in wide nets thrown by fishermen, or caught with hooks and lines by anglers sitting on floating papyrus rafts. Plants grew along the riverbank and were cut down for use. For example, rushes were used to weave matting and baskets. Lotus blossoms were gathered to decorate rich people's banquets.
Crops were planted as soon as the Nile floodwaters went down. Egyptian farmers used oxen to pull their wooden plows. If they could not afford to keep animals, they would dig the rich black mud by hand using digging sticks and hoes.
The shadoof allowed farmers to lift water from the river onto their fields with minimum effort. The weight at one end of the pole balanced the water bucket at the other end.
Plowing and sowing took place at the same time. The plowman drove cattle and plow, and the sower walked behind him scattering seed. At the time of harvest, crops were cut down using sickles.
Hunting wild fowl in the marshes along the banks of the Nile River was reserved for wealthy Egyptians. Wealthy Egyptians enjoyed pleasant days hunting in the damp, shady reed beds, away from the heat and sand and dust of cities and palaces.
In ancient Egypt, as in many other civilizations, religion, politics, local tradition, and everyday customs were mingled together. It is hard to discover in detail what people really believed. Evidence, such as a few prayers and early texts written on papyrus, tells us that the Egyptians worshipped many gods. It also suggests that people at all levels of Egyptian society, from priests to peasants, were prepared to spend time and money on their religious beliefs. Pharaohs paid for elaborate tombs and temples. Peasants gave food offerings or purchased lucky charms. Why did the Egyptians have so many gods? Each one served a particular need. Some gods originated in ancient tribal traditions, such as the sacred bull Apis, who was worshipped, or the cats dedicated to the goddess Bastet. Others, such as the sun god Ra, developed out of Egyptians' reverence for nature. Some gods were honored throughout the land, some only locally. Some gods and goddesses had special functions. Pregnant women prayed to the goddess Taweret to keep them safe in childbirth. Farmers prayed to the gods of the Nile for floods to water their crops.
Some gods looked human. Others had the heads of animals and birds. Many were shown carrying symbols of their powers. In some centuries, certain gods were popular, while others were almost ignored. But one important religious belief hardly changed. This was the idea of Ma'at, justice, and good order. The Egyptians believed that the gods ruled the world, and it was people's duty to live according to their will and to maintain Ma'at so far as was possible. For different groups in society, Ma'at meant different things. Soldiers had to fight bravely. Peasants had to work hard, and pharaohs had to rule well. Then the gods would be pleased.
Mummies are perhaps the most famous and intriguing type of evidence to have survived from Egyptian times. It is an extraordinary feeling to be able to look at the face, however crumbling or shriveled, of somebody who lived over 4,000 years ago. The outer casings of a mummy, and the coffin or sarcophagus in which it was buried, can tell us about the Egyptians' religious beliefs, and sometimes about the long, complicated funeral ceremonies they arranged. We can discover how old the mummified persons were when they died, some of the illnesses they had suffered from, and probably how wealthy they had been. We may even be able to find out what individual Egyptians looked like, or more accurately, how they wished to be remembered forevermore. Making mummies was a skilled and unpleasant process. Bodies rotted quickly in the hot Egyptian sun. Many ordinary people could not afford a beautifully decorated mummy or coffin. Their bodies were preserved as quickly and cheaply as possible. In contrast, the families of important people lavished a great deal of money and time in preparing the best possible mummy of their dead relative. Many pharaohs and their wives are buried in the Valley of the Kings in graves tunneled deep into the rocky hillside. Most of these graves were discovered and robbed hundreds of years ago, but the site of Tutankhamun's grave lay undisturbed for almost 3,000 years.
The Egyptians mummified dead people in the hope of providing them with everlasting life. While their bodies survived, their spirits would also. But in preserving their dead people as mummies, the ancient Egyptians have also helped to keep alive the memory of their magnificent civilization for many thousands of years.
Mummies often had more than one coffin. For example, Tutankhamun had 4. They were made from wood, which was then heavily decorated on the outside with both paint and gold leaf. Even the inside of the sarcophagus was richly decorated with images of the gods from the underworld, for example, Osiris and Isis. This was done so that the dead person might have a fair judgment from these gods. Carefully undoing the bandages of a mummy reveals a grisly, dried, yet fully preserved body. Noble mummies also had face masks, often made from gold and precious stones. These showed what the dead person looked like.
Mummies were made by specialist workers who became very skilled at their rather unpleasant job. First, they removed the soft tissues, heart, lungs, stomach, intestines, and brain, from the body. These were preserved separately in canopic jars. Then they packed the body with natron, a chemical that dried and preserved it. Then they smeared the dried body with sweet-smelling oils and gums, and sprinkled it with herbs. Finally, the mummy's limbs were arranged in a dignified way, and it was tightly wrapped in bandages and cloth. Now it could be placed in its decorated coffin, and was ready for burial. Hopefully, it would last forever. As we have seen, the Egyptians worshipped animals kept at certain temples, like the Apis bulls at Memphis, or the cats at Bubastis, which were sacred to the goddess Bastet. To show their respect for the gods, they often turned these sacred animals into mummies when they died, and buried them close to the temple. They thought this would win them favors from the gods. Some temples even bred animals specially for sacrifice and later mummification. Thousands of dead hawks have been found at the temple dedicated to the hawk god Horus, in fields near his temple at Idfu.
Behold, the heart of His Majesty was satisfied with making a very great monument. This inscription on Pharaoh Amenhotep III's temple at Luxor explains why these magnificent buildings were built. The very great monument showed the pharaoh's power. It showed religious devotion and revealed good taste. Most important, as a monument to the pharaoh and his gods, a temple would last forever. Most Egyptian temples were arranged like palaces because a holy statue of the god lived or visited there. Every day the statue was in residence, the senior priests washed and fed it. They gave it offerings of food and perfumes. Sometimes the statue was taken from one temple and moved to another, or was carried in procession through the streets or in boats along the Nile. The Egyptians did not worship the statue itself. Rather, it reminded them of the presence of the god, whose invisible spirit might come to them at any time. Not all temples were palaces for the gods. Some were built over royal tombs to worship the memory of a dead pharaoh and to glorify his achievements in this life. Queen Hatshepsut arranged for a beautiful mortuary temple to commemorate her time in power. It contains almost 200 statues portraying episodes during her reign.
Philae is an Egyptian town on an island in the Nile. Like many Egyptian towns, a large area is devoted to religious buildings. Pilgrims traveled here to worship at temples dedicated to the goddess Isis. The rest of the island is covered with mud brick homes.
There were many myths involving the gods about how the world began. Many believed the world was created by Ra, who had emerged from a lotus flower rising out of the first ever waters. He made the world by ordering Shu, god of air, to separate the sky goddess Nut from the earth god Geb. These were the parents of Osiris, whose life story was the most popular Egyptian legend. Osiris was said to have been murdered by his jealous brother Set, but Isis, Osiris's wife, brought him back to life. The god Horus, son of Isis and Osiris, fought and defeated the evil god Set. Some gods became associated with particular professions, like Thoth, the god of scribes, and Ta, the god of craftsmen. Certain animals were also sacred, being linked to a god. For example, the cat goddess Bastet. One of the most important sacred animals was the Apis bull, who was respected as though he were a pharaoh.
Amun-Ra was two gods in one, made by uniting a local god of thieves, Amun, with the sun god, Ra. He was the most powerful god during the New Kingdom. Anubis was the god of the dead, who watched over the embalming ritual. He is often shown with the head of a jackal, as they were thought to haunt cemeteries. This goddess is usually shown as a cat. She was believed to protect women, children, and the sun's power to ripen crops. She was loved, and it was not allowed to harm cats. Bes was a short, fat, cheerful god who was very popular as he guarded children from evil spirits. He also was thought to enjoy dancing and singing. This goddess is sometimes shown as a lovely lady when she represents dancing, music, joy, and love. She is also shown with the head of a cow as a symbol of motherly love. Imhotep was a real person. He was a brilliant scribe and architect who designed the first pyramid, called the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. In later history, he came to be worshipped as the god of wisdom. The goddess Isis was the wife of Osiris and mother of Horus. This family of gods was the most famous in Egyptian mythology. Isis symbolized the perfect mother. Hapi was the generous god of the Nile. The river's yearly flood was seen as his arrival, which brought wealth and fertility to the land and people of ancient Egypt. Horus was the son of Isis and Osiris. He was usually shown as a falcon, or falcon-headed. The pharaohs thought that they represented Horus on earth. Nut was the sky goddess and sister of Geb, the earth god. Nut is often painted blue and covered in stars. Legend had it that she swallowed the sun at night, and it was reborn at sunrise. Ra was the sun god, who rolled the sun across the sky by day, just as a scarab beetle rolls a ball of dung. He was reborn every dawn aged in daytime, and died at night. He was joined to Amun and called Amun-Ra. Crocodiles lived in the Nile and were sacred. The crocodile god Sabak had his temple at Kom-Ombo on the banks of the Nile. He was believed to control the river's water and marshes. Osiris was married to Isis and was the father of Horus. His death and rebirth made him the god of the afterlife. The pharaohs believed that they joined him after their own deaths. Set was Osiris's brother and murderer. He was the symbol of all evil and was depicted as an extraordinary creature with the features of different animals. She was the goddess of childbirth and protected both the mother and baby. She is shown as a pregnant, standing hippopotamus.
Each temple was dedicated to the worship of one god or goddess. It contained a shrine with a statue in which the god was believed to live. Only the king and priests were allowed to enter this most sacred part of the temple, the Holy of Holies. The priests were responsible for looking after the god's daily needs. They offered the god fresh linen, food, water, and incense 3 times a day.
Sekhmet was the goddess of war. She caused death in battle. Ptah was the creator god, and was often worshipped alongside Sekhmet, the destroyer.
The scarab represented eternal life to the ancient Egyptians. Model scarabs are found in many tombs.
The dog-headed Anubis was believed to act as a guide to souls during their journey through the kingdom of the dead. Amenhotep III had as his divine protector the crocodile-headed god Sabak. Traditionally, Sabak had been worshipped in the marshy lake area known as the Fayum, probably because many crocodiles lived there, and local people feared them. But gradually, his cult spread throughout Egypt. Amenhotep gave generously to build temples, especially at Luxor.
Because temples were designed as homes for the gods, they included many features usually found in royal palaces. Lakes were admired for their peaceful beauty, a foretaste of life after death, perhaps. They also provided a cool, pleasant place where priests and worshippers could rest. Egyptians believed that the souls of the dead were carried to the next world on funeral boats. Ancient Egyptian temples were usually home to a specific god or dedicated to a dead king. The ancient Egyptian temple of Luxor was built on the bank of the Nile, 2 miles down the road from the temple of Karnak. This temple, which was begun in the 1200s BC, was built to honor the god Amun. Under the rule of Ramses, he adorned the temple with statues of himself and 2 obelisks. Egyptian craftsmen were extremely skilled. Like Egyptian farmers, they achieved great success using very simple tools. The materials they worked with were not easy to manipulate. Even so, they managed to produce a high level of finish on carvings, statues, jewelry, and other decorative objects. In most periods of Egyptian history, artists and craftsmen were content to copy or slightly improve upon earlier styles. They followed well-established traditions which showed respect for pharaohs and the gods. Change for its own sake was not particularly valued. Many people preferred something familiar to something new. But slowly, innovations did take place. Statues of famous people were carved in new poses, and painters began to depict animals, gods, and people in experimental styles. In Memphis and Thebes, there were many busy craftsmen, all specialists in a particular trade. Paintings from Theban tombs portray a wide variety of crafts. There were leather workers, sandal makers, stone carvers, metal workers, chariot makers, sculptors, carpenters, jewelers, scribes, and boat builders in one 6th dynasty tomb alone. Most artists and craftsmen worked for the king, government, and the temples. They were employed in large, organized workshops. But when they had surplus goods to spare, villagers traveled into the towns to exchange their agricultural produce for these finely made objects. Many towns had regular markets and occasional festivals, usually connected with the Nile flood seasons, good harvests, or a favorite local god. The Egyptians were skilled craftsmen who created treasures made of gold, pottery, metal, and glass. Glass was made from melted sand mixed with mineral salts found in the desert. Some of the finest Egyptian statues were made of bronze. Several steps were involved in making a metal statue. First, a mold was used, usually of clay. Then, the ready-mixed metal, bronze is a mixture of copper and tin, was melted over a hot fire. The melted bronze was then carried to the mold. Very carefully it was poured into the mold. The smallest splashes could cause a nasty burn. It was then left to cool. This took several days. Finally, the mold was split open and the finished cast was trimmed and polished. From unfinished tomb paintings, we have learned about the various stages used by artists to produce beautiful murals. First, a grid of squares was drawn on the wall. Then the mural outline was copied onto the wall from a smaller plan drawn out in squares. This helped correct the painting's proportions. Then the scenes were painted in over the wall grid. Wealthy Egyptians enjoyed life to the full. They believed they would continue to enjoy it in the afterlife if they painted images of their favorite pastimes and possessions on the tomb walls. The nobility and the well-off held large banquets. These were splendid affairs filled with music and dance. Musicians played the harp, flute, and other string and wind instruments. The dancers even made music as they performed with cymbals, bells, and rattles. The guests were also entertained with jugglers, acrobats, and magicians.
Board games were a popular form of indoor entertainment for adults and children. Senet was a favorite one, as well as snake and dog and jackal. The Egyptians also enjoyed the outdoor life. Their skills included hunting wildfowl with boomerangs and throw sticks. The wildfowl were attracted by tame birds, which were held up in the air by their feet. Amazingly, cats were trained to find and retrieve the dead wildfowl.
Pharaohs and their courtiers were entertained at feasts in the palace by dancers and musicians. Favorite instruments included harps, drums, and cymbals. Egyptian dancers were well-trained and acrobatic. Tomb paintings show dancers performing cartwheels, somersaults, high kicks, and even splits. Other entertainers included wrestlers and storytellers.
We know that Egyptian builders had the skills and technology to construct large, elaborate homes. But most Egyptians did not have the money to pay for these palaces. So where did the vast majority of ordinary people live? We can get some idea of what ordinary houses were like in Egypt by looking at model houses that have been found buried in tombs. We can also look at surviving Egyptian houses built in the traditional way. Both were constructed of sun-dried mud, covered over with a thin layer of plaster. Both were built to a simple, squarish design, with a flat roof, sometimes topped by a terrace where the inhabitants could sit and enjoy the cool, fresh evening air. Inside, the rooms were small and dark, with narrow windows and low ceilings. Some houses had 2 stories. Others were all on 1 level. Many had cellars for storage, dug into the rough ground underneath. Most people lived in villages, clustered along the banks of the river. Village houses were built close together for strength and security. The villages were surrounded by ditches and fields. Nearby was the bleak, inhospitable, endless expanse of the desert, for the Egyptians, the home of the dead. At certain times of the year, particularly in springtime, hot desert winds blew dust and sand into every corner of Egyptian homes.
Various forms of wildlife also found their way into Egyptian houses through cracks in the plaster or between crumbling bricks. Some, such as swallows and house martins, were harmless. Others, such as rats, flies, and mosquitoes, spread dangerous disease. People feared snakes and scorpions most of all. Their bites were painful and could kill. Egyptian palaces were built of dried mud bricks, but life inside was elegant, comfortable, and luxurious. Royal palaces could be 2 or 3 stories tall. Hollow channels between the floors allowed cool breezes to circulate, a simple form of air conditioning. By the time of the New Kingdom, many palaces had lavatories and even showers. After a shower, pharaohs and their families would retreat to the nearby oiling room, where their skins would be massaged and softened by smooth, scented oils.
The Great Pyramid at Giza, made as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, is the largest stone monument ever built on Earth. Construction work started almost 4,600 years ago. It contains over 2 million carefully shaped blocks, each weighing, on average, around 2.5 tons. All pyramids were made using only the simplest technology, without iron tools, powered engines, or wheels. Together, they are an astonishing engineering achievement. It was usual for a pharaoh to start arranging for his tomb to be built as soon as he came to power. Khufu's Great Pyramid took about 23 years to complete. Considering the tools and equipment the Egyptians had to work with, that was remarkably quick. The pyramids were built using gangs of laborers, about 18 or 20 to each gang. The gangs had nicknames such as Vigorous or Tough, which they sometimes scratched on the pyramid stones. About 4,000 laborers were employed to build the Great Pyramid. They were mostly villagers, conscripted by the pharaoh's officials, in the same way that other men were sent to join the army. They were paid their wages in food, bread, dried meat, and beer, and lived in specially built villages set up around the construction site. The hostile deserts were called Deshret, or Red Land. The deserts were the source of the Egyptians' building materials. Statues and huge obelisks for temples were cut from granite. Sandstone was used for massive gateways, halls, and columns of temples, and limestone was used to build the pyramids. From the eastern desert, between the Nile and the Red Sea coast, the Egyptians obtained vast quantities of gold, copper, and semi-precious stones like orange-red cornelian, green feldspar, and turquoise. Egyptian bricks were made from mud, mixed with water, and finely chopped straw. This sticky mass was stirred well, then packed carefully into square or oblong wooden molds, smoothed down, and left in the hot sun to dry. As the water evaporated, each brick became solid. Then, the bricks were turned out of their molds to allow the drying to finish. When ready, the bricks were rock hard and very strong. Finally, they were carted, a few at a time, to the building site. The Egyptians invented many important construction methods, which are still used today.
The pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu at Giza in northern Egypt is often called the Great Pyramid because of its size. It is 486 feet high and covers 2,556 square feet. Pharaoh Khufu lived between 2551 to 2528 BC. Located outside Memphis, the oldest part of historic Egypt, is the city of Saqqara. Saqqara is home to the most famous and well-preserved step pyramid in Egypt, built around 2900 BC. This step pyramid was built as a burial tomb for the Egyptian king Zoser. It is the earliest built pyramid in Egypt.
Travel by boat was the method of transportation for many ancient Egyptians. Traveling by boat allowed Egyptians to reach much of the country by way of the Nile River. Donkeys provided another method of transportation, especially for those who did not live in the towns or cities, such as the farmer.
The geography of Egypt makes it a difficult place to rule. It is a very long country, about 750 miles from north to south. Apart from a narrow muddy strip along both sides of the river, and even this is sometimes flooded, the land is desert. In ancient times, there were hardly any roads. The best way to travel was along the river, but this was very slow. It could take about 3 weeks to reach Nubia from the city of Memphis. How could the pharaohs keep control? Successful pharaohs coped with this problem of government in two different ways. They relied on trustworthy local governors to rule the provinces for them, and they recruited an enormous number of scribes. The scribes, along with certain other officials, sent and received royal messages and kept detailed records of everything that concerned government, law, and taxes. Many of these records have survived. They can tell us a lot about how the Egyptian government worked. It took a long, slow training to become a scribe. Trainees started young, before they were 12, and were made to work very hard while learning. Sometimes they were beaten. The Egyptians had a saying, "A boy's book is on his back."
Egyptian scribes wrote on paper called papyrus that was made from reeds. They used ink made of soot. Sometimes they decorated their writings with red ink as well. The Egyptians were among the earliest people in the world to invent writing in around 3000 BC. They wrote using picture symbols known as hieroglyphs. Some hieroglyphs stood for the sounds that make up words. Others stood for ideas or for actual objects. For example, the hieroglyph for the sound we make when we say R was an open mouth. The hieroglyph for the idea of drunkenness was a jar of beer. Scribes had to combine several hieroglyphs to spell each word in the document they were writing. Hieroglyphs could be written across, left to right and right to left, or down the page in columns. Words were spelled without vowels, the letters A, E, I, O, and U. Here, you can see how the Egyptians would have written the word for crocodile. It was spelled M-S-H, and probably pronounced as Emsa.
Egyptians wrote on paper called papyrus. To make papyrus, the tall reeds of the papyrus plant were chopped into short lengths and then peeled. The inner pith was sliced into thin strips. The strips were arranged in layers on a wooden board. They overlapped in a crisscross pattern. They were then covered with a cloth and pounded with a heavy mallet. This made them stick together into a single sheet. The cloth was removed, and the newly made sheet of papyrus was polished with a smooth stone. It could then be trimmed.
Scribes also kept records of tribute payments. Tribute, paid in food, treasures, or by sending men to work, was collected by the pharaoh's officials from ordinary people. Egyptian towns and cities served two main purposes. They were the centers of government and the centers of trade. Egypt was divided for government and taxation into 42 districts, known as nomes. There was a leading town in each nome. In addition, certain major cities, such as Memphis and Thebes, acted as national capitals throughout Egyptian history. In addition, certain major cities, such as Memphis and Thebes, acted as national capitals throughout Egyptian history. The pharaohs built splendid palaces at both Memphis and Thebes. Not everyone in ancient Egypt lived in a town or city. Many farmers had to travel to reach trading places. Using donkeys allowed farmers to carry heavy loads to the markets. Markets in small, remote towns were full of locally grown produce. Goods were bartered, exchanged, because the Egyptians did not use coins. But in larger towns, goods from many lands were on sale. Goods on sale in Egypt came from Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean world. Trading journeys were long and dangerous. It could take months to bring a precious cargo home. Perfumes came from Punt, present-day Somalia, silver from Syria, and precious stones from Ethiopia and Afghanistan. Cedar wood came from Lebanon, iron from Palestine, gold and copper from Nubia, and olive oil from Greece.
The pharaoh's officials made sure that trade was fair and that taxes were paid. They settled disputes about cheating. Weights were used in a balance to help work out the value of goods.
To the Egyptians, their pharaoh was more than just a king. He was the living image of a god come down to earth. As such, he was respected, feared, and occasionally worshipped. The pharaoh was the only person who could speak directly to the gods in their temples. He gave them gifts of food and wine, and in return asked them to send blessings to the people he ruled. As well as having religious duties, an Egyptian pharaoh was responsible for running the government. He had to maintain law and order, protect temples, and lead his armies to war. A pharaoh also had to be good at managing people. He needed to win the support of powerful nobles and chief priests to stop them from plotting against him. He had to make sure that his government officials used their power to benefit the country, not just to make money for themselves. He received foreign ambassadors in his palace and made peace treaties with kings and princes from distant lands. Often, this meant marrying a foreign princess to strengthen the alliance. Some pharaohs had a great many official wives. The special name for the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, really means royal house, and originally referred to the ruler's palace. The Egyptians believed that their king was a god, whose father was Ra, the sun god. The pharaoh was ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt. He was high priest of all the temples, head of law and administration, and commander-in-chief of the army. The king wore a number of different crowns and carried a scepter, crook, and flail. These signified his power over the land, agriculture, and people of Upper and Lower Egypt. On his forehead, he wore the cobra symbol to protect him from evil, and his name was written within an oval called a cartouche. His face was often shown on a sphinx, whose lion's body expressed his superhuman strength. He had to be skilled at hunting and sport. After a 30-year reign, he had to run along a special track to prove that he was still fit to rule.
Royal women in Egypt were respected as the wives and mothers of pharaohs. Once, when a king of Babylon asked Pharaoh Amenhotep III for one of his daughters as a wife, Amenhotep III haughtily refused. "The daughter of the king of Egypt is not given to anyone," he said. Among the most famous of the powerful Egyptian women was Queen Hatshepsut. She ruled the country from 1473 to 1458 BC with her stepson, Pharaoh Thutmose III.
The pharaoh's royal palaces were vast, sprawling buildings. So many people lived and worked there that they were more like little villages than family homes. There was a great reception hall where the pharaoh received royal visitors, listened to his advisors, and granted, or refused, requests from petitioners groveling on their knees. There were private rooms and bedrooms for the pharaoh and his family, offices for his ministers, and guardrooms and quarters for soldiers and servants. The longest ruling pharaoh of all time was Pepi II, who reigned for 94 years. He ruled during the Old Kingdom period, from 2221 to 2157 BC, but was not, however, a powerful pharaoh, and failed to maintain Egypt's former prosperity. Ramses II was one of the greatest warrior pharaohs, and personally led his troops into battle. He was the pharaoh who fought Egypt's long-standing enemy, the Hittites. Ramses II was also a great builder, and built the temple at Abu Simbel. The most unusual pharaoh was Akhenaten. He broke a long tradition of worshipping many gods choosing to honor only one, the sun's disk, called Aten. He was hated for this after his death, and the city he founded at El Amarna was destroyed. Nefertiti, his wife, was famous for her beauty. The pharaoh could have many wives, but only one great wife, who was usually the eldest daughter of the previous king and queen. Hatshepsut was one of the few women to rule Egypt. She wore a pharaoh's crown and false beard, and was buried in the Valley of the Kings. Queen Hatshepsut was meant to rule until her stepson, Thutmose III, was old enough to reign, but she took power and for 20 years ruled as pharaoh herself. Narmer was the king who united Upper and Lower Egypt and probably established Memphis as the capital. Zoser commissioned the Step Pyramid at Saqqara. It was designed by his famous scribe and architect, Imhotep.
Khufu made Egypt very prosperous and built the Great Pyramid at Giza in about 2500 BC. Khafra was probably Khufu's son. He built the second pyramid at Giza and the Sphinx. Menkora built the third of the famous pyramids at Giza. Unas's pyramid was the first to contain pyramid texts, which describe religious rituals in hieroglyphs.
Mentuhotep reunited the country after over 100 years of confusion and civil war. His 50-year reign gave him time to establish order and strong government. Senusret extended the Egyptian empire farther into Nubia, Palestine, and Syria. He also developed a system of local government. Amenemhat III built a complex irrigation system which took more water into Lower Egypt and reduced the danger of flooding. The Hyksos ruled Egypt from 1750 to 1550 BC. The Hyksos were a warlike tribe from the east who invaded and ruled ancient Egypt until they were expelled by Ahmose I. But some of their influence lived on, including the chariot.
Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos, who were a nomadic tribe from Asia. They had ruled Egypt for about 100 years. Thutmose III was a successful pharaoh when he eventually came to power. He strengthened Egypt's foreign empire. He commissioned many of the great temples at Karnak and Luxor. He was Akhenaten's father. The discovery of his tomb in 1922 made him the best-known pharaoh. He ruled from the age of 9 to 17, when he was possibly murdered. Ramses III was the last great Egyptian pharaoh. His reign was troubled by the first workers' strike and an assassination attempt.
Taharko was a Nubian king who was one of a series of foreign rulers. Alexander the Great was a great warrior. He conquered Egypt in 332 BC. He called himself Pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria. Ptolemy, a commander in Alexander the Great's army, took power after his death. So began the Ptolemaic dynasty. Cleopatra was Ptolemy VIII's sister. She had a love affair with Mark Antony, a Roman general. They committed suicide a year after she lost power to the Romans. Augustus defeated Cleopatra and ruled Egypt as a province of Rome. He was a firm ruler and defeated rebellions.
Egyptian society was arranged rather like a pyramid. The pharaoh was at the top and was a religious leader as well as being responsible for running the government. Then came high priests and nobles. Lower down were priests, officials, and army commanders. The fourth layer included merchants and skilled classes like scribes, artists, and craftsmen. At the bottom came the poorest groups, the laborers and the peasants.
Pharaohs, and sometimes gods, were portrayed wearing several different types of crown. Each crown had a special meaning, and on ceremonial occasions, pharaohs also wore a false beard, made of tightly plaited hair, ornamented with gold and jewels. The white crown was traditionally worn by kings of Upper Egypt, the lands in the southern part of the country. The red crown was traditionally worn by kings of Lower Egypt, the marshy northern lands surrounding the Nile Delta. Ever since Pharaoh Menes, who came to power around 2920 BC, the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt had been ruled by one pharaoh. To make this clear, many pharaohs chose to be portrayed wearing a double crown, that is, the red and white crowns together. A smaller blue war crown was worn whenever the pharaoh led troops in battle.
Princes and princesses were carried on litters above the heads of the crowd. This princess is entering a reception room. It has high painted ceilings supported on tall columns. The walls are plastered white and then decorated with brightly colored patterns or pictures of animals, fruit, and flowers. Entertainment was supplied by dancers and musicians, while servants offered food and drink to the pharaoh and his guests. Guests included high-ranking nobles and officials from Egypt and neighboring countries.
A servant from the pharaoh's palace would often carry food to offer to the gods. What the servant offered the gods often gave clues about what the pharaohs themselves ate: bread, duck, figs, and grapes.
Abu Simbel was the site of two temples built by Ramses the Great. The facade of the larger temple is adorned with statues of Ramses with his queen Nefertari and his daughters at his feet. Ramses ordered the construction of the temple so that 2 days a year, on his birthday and his coronation day, the rising sun's rays would completely illuminate the insides of the chamber. The Egyptian government was well prepared for fighting. The pharaohs maintained a standing army, lodged in barracks in important cities. These troops were tough, well-fed, and fit. The first main period of expansion came during the Middle Kingdom, when Egyptian troops occupied Nubia. It was a land rich in treasures: gold, ebony, ivory, leopard skins, and black African recruits. Later, during the New Kingdom, the Egyptians attacked the civilizations of Syria and Palestine. Again, they went in search of loot. Around 1640 BC, Egypt was invaded by a group of people from foreign lands called the Hyksos, who stayed for over 100 years. A further series of attacks came around 1190 BC from groups of warriors based in countries to the north and west. The Egyptians called them the peoples of the sea and eventually defeated them. As Pharaoh Ramses III proudly reported, his ships defended the coast like a strong wall. Egyptian warships, which were driven by oars as well as sails, were faster and easier to steer than enemy craft.
Warfare was brutal. Ramses III also boasted that he had seen his enemies overthrown in their blood and made into heaps. Pharaohs, wearing a special crown, led their armies into battle, surrounded by hand-picked troops. The early Egyptians fought with bows and arrows, spears, clubs, and axes. Chariots, curved swords, and body armor were introduced later on. After the time of the Hyksos invasion, Egyptian craftsmen copied designs for deadly, high-powered bows from their Asian neighbors. Most soldiers carried shields, did not wear helmets, and fought barefoot. Both sides in a battle fought to kill, but if any of Egypt's enemies were captured alive, the men were forced to fight in the Egyptian army, or were sent to work as slaves.
The lands ruled by Egypt and the frontier areas where pharaohs fought with peoples living nearby included the Libyans, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Sea Peoples, the Canaanites, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Nubians.
Egyptian soldiers fought mostly on foot. They aimed to scatter the enemy by a sudden, fierce attack. Weapons included spears for throwing, long and short swords for slicing, axe heads, stone-tipped arrows, and heavy wooden clubs.
A pharaoh rides into battle in his light, fast chariot. Usually a chariot was manned by toe soldiers, a driver, and an archer armed with arrows and spears.
The Great Pyramid at Giza, made as a tomb for Pharaoh Khufu, is the largest stone monument ever built on Earth. Construction work started almost 4,600 years ago. It contains over 2 million carefully shaped blocks, each weighing, on average, around 2.5 tons. All pyramids were made using only the simplest technology, without iron tools, powered engines, or wheels. Together, they are an astonishing engineering achievement. It was usual for a pharaoh to start arranging for his tomb to be built as soon as he came to power. Khufu's Great Pyramid took about 23 years to complete. Considering the tools and equipment the Egyptians had to work with, that was remarkably quick. The pyramids were built using gangs of laborers, about 18 or 20 to each gang. The gangs had nicknames such as Vigorous or Tough, which they sometimes scratched on the pyramid stones. About 4,000 laborers were employed to build the Great Pyramid. They were mostly villagers conscripted by the pharaoh's officials in the same way that other men were sent to join the army. They were paid their wages in food, bread, dried meat, and beer, and lived in specially built villages set up around the construction site. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was one of the most exciting events in 20th century archaeology. Explorers knew that many rulers of ancient Egypt had been buried in the Valley of the Kings, but they also knew that most of these graves had been robbed long ago. Tutankhamun's tomb had itself been disturbed at some time in the past, but the robbers had failed to discover the secret burial chamber where the mummified body of the young pharaoh lay hidden. For 35 centuries, knowledge of Tutankhamun's grave was lost. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, many explorers traveled to Egypt, hoping to discover more about its past. Howard Carter, the British archaeologist who discovered Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, spent many years of his life studying the remains of ancient Egypt. Even with his expert knowledge, he was still amazed at the richness and the beauty of the objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb chambers. Tutankhamun's burial chamber reveals the immense wealth of the ruling royal family who prepared his tomb. His grave is probably the most famous and best preserved of all Egyptian royal burials, but despite its splendor and lavishness, it may not have been unique. The types of objects found there are typical of royal and noble burials. They did not only reflect Tutankhamun's status in this world, but also were all designed to help him in the world of the dead.
The precious objects put into a tomb alongside a dead person were chosen with great care. They included food and drink, models of servants and guards, and even means of travel. This was because the purpose of an Egyptian burial was to help the dead person live again for millions and millions of years. Life on earth was uncertain and sometimes sad. True happiness was to be found after death. The Egyptians believed that by carefully preserving a dead body, you would also preserve its spirit and give it everlasting life.
A tomb was, therefore, a house of eternity. Often, important people designed their own tombs while they were still alive. Tutankhamun did not do this, probably because he died so young. For him, royal officials provided everything his spirit might need for its everlasting life, from food and drink to musical instruments and fans. But this new life was not lived in the tomb itself. That was simply where the body was kept. Tutankhamun's spirit, like everyone else's, had to travel to another world, the peaceful kingdom of the dead. And so the officials included all that his spirit needed for this last dangerous journey: boats, guardian statues, clothes, and weapons. All pyramids were made using only the simplest technology. Pyramids were built in several stages. First, the foundations were leveled and base stones laid. Then, sloping ramps were built out of rubble. Heavy stone blocks were dragged up these ramps as the steps of the pyramid were built. The steps were filled in with smaller wedge-shaped blocks to give the pyramid a smoothly sloping shape. Finally, the burial chambers inside were hollowed out and decorated. After about 1100 BC, Egyptian power began to decline. This was because of several reasons: discontent at home, enemies abroad, and the impact of new technology. For many years, from about 1100 to 950 BC, Egypt was divided in two. Libyan merchants ruled the north, while temple priests, based in Thebes, controlled the south. Then Libyan soldiers, paid to guard the desert frontiers, rebelled. A Libyan high priest, Sheshonq, became pharaoh and ruled successfully for many years. But more troubles followed. Around 730 BC, the Nubians invaded and conquered land as far north as Thebes. In 663 BC, Assyrian armies attacked. They were armed with new iron weapons and swiftly won control. A cunning Egyptian prince, Psamtik, negotiated a peace treaty and shortly afterwards took over. He invited foreign merchants to come and settle in Egypt in the hope that they would help them rebuild Egypt's wealth and power. In the short term, he succeeded, but Egypt's new prosperity made the land an even more attractive target for would-be conquerors.
Invaders came again in 525 BC. Persian troops attacked and established a new ruling family which governed for almost 200 years. They were overthrown by the armies of Alexander the Great, a brilliantly successful war leader from Macedon in northern Greece in 332 BC. When he died, it was arranged for a Greek ruling dynasty, the Ptolemies, to succeed him. The end of independent Egyptian civilization finally came in 30 BC, when Cleopatra, last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, committed suicide rather than be taken prisoner by Roman troops. Not long afterward, Egypt was declared to be a province of Rome. In 634 AD, the remains of Roman control were swept away, and Egypt became part of a mighty new Muslim empire, based in Damascus and later Baghdad. The Egyptians did not fully regain their independence until 1952.
Cleopatra VII, the last independent ruler of Egypt. Her armies were defeated by Roman troops loyal to Emperor Augustus. Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egyptian queens and kings. They had originally come from Greece, but had been settled in Egypt for around 250 years. Cleopatra killed herself when the Romans conquered Egypt because she preferred a noble death to foreign rule. Many centuries later, she became famous as the heroine of a play by William Shakespeare.
Under the rule of Caesar Augustus, conqueror of Egypt, Egypt lost its independence, but became prosperous. Trade increased as the people of Rome were eager to buy Egyptian corn to make bread. The Roman rulers introduced new laws and heavy taxes, which the Egyptian people disliked. Through contacts with Rome, Egyptian ideas, especially in math and medicine, together with Egyptian beliefs, spread far beyond Egypt and throughout the Roman Empire.